when I last talked about Zen, I was discussing it as a dialogue between master and student, and I was discussing it to a great extent in relation to Far Eastern culture, how it is in effect a method of liberation from the culture. All of us need to be liberated from our culture to a certain extent, because education is a kind of necessary evil. And when the process of education or acculturation has been completed, we need a cure for it. Education is like salting meat in order to preserve it for eating. But when you're ready to cook it and eat it, you need to soak some of the salt out. So in the process of being brought up by one's parents and one's teachers, you are in one way spoiled, although in another way made tolerable to live with. And so in our culture, it's increasingly fashionable to have psychoanalysis when you've finished with education, so as to work out and resolve all the damage and traumatic shocks that were done to you in the process. And it's becoming something that in sophisticated circles one goes through, not because you're a mentally sick person, but because it's considered beneficial to general mental health. And this is our fumbling attempt, you see, to find a cure for our own culture. We need a cure, of course, because the thing that we lose in the course of being brought up is spontaneity. That's what's so delightful about a child, as well as so objectionable, that children are just plain spontaneous, and when they do it in a way that pleases us, we think they're delightful. And when they do it in a way that doesn't please us, we think they're horrid. And so we pretty much kill the spontaneity in them in order to get certainly that they won't be horrid and that they will be nice, but in a rather phony way. And this is such a disaster, isn't it? Because when we watch a child, say, dancing, and it's never learned it, never had a single dancing lesson, and is really just dancing for fun, we say that's delightful. Then eventually the child notices that this is a way of getting attention and becomes self-conscious about dancing, and then we send it to dancing school, and it becomes stiff and wretched. And only after many, many years of practice does the child, as a dancer, now a young man or woman, recapture the spontaneity of childhood. It's got to go all that long way around to get back to the thing that it once had. And it's terribly difficult. So in the same way, with we might say, the general attitude to life, that a child is taught to live as a child is taught to dance. It has to observe the rules. And in so doing, this thing arises that bugs us human beings beyond belief. That is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is, in one sense, our pride as human beings. It's the great thing we have. We can not only be happy, but we can know we're happy. We can not only think, but we can think about thinking. And therein lies the whole possibility of reasoning. To think about thinking, to know about knowing, to be aware of what one does. Herein is the whole birth of a rational control of behavior, which you might say is the glory of civilization and the glory of man. At the same time, it's a perfect pest, because how do you know when to stop thinking about thinking? For instance, you think over a problem, you've got to make a decision. How long should you think about it? How much evidence should you collect before you take a step? You never know. Actually, what most of us do is we think about a given decision until it's a nuisance, and then or the time is too late to think about it anymore, then we do something. We never are sure that we decided the right thing. And one of the troubles about thinking about decisions is there are ever so many unpredictable variables that come into everything. And you may work out the most perfect business contract and everything is fine, but you didn't bargain for the banana skin that you were going to slip on, on your way to your partner's office or whatever it was. Such things couldn't be predicted in any amount of decision-making. And the more we try to elaborate perfectly foolproof methods of arranging our lives, the more we find ourselves encumbered with impossible details. That's the fallacy of too much law. When we provide for everything in the law, suddenly find you can't move without filling out 300 forms, and without consulting all sorts of bureaucrats, without hiring a staff of lawyers and accountants and all kinds of things to be sure you don't make the wrong move. After a while, the game ceases to be worth the candle. I mean, life becomes so safe that it's not worth living at all. So this is one of the problems of being self-conscious. And all education, you see, is an instruction in self-consciousness. What do you learn in education? You learn fundamentally words. In other words, symbols about reality. And through words, we're able to talk about living. And so think about living. And so have knowledge about it. You see, no knowledge is academically respectable knowledge unless it's knowledge in terms of words or in terms of numbers. That is to say, in terms of a symbolic language about life. But you see, once you're in that position, once you know that you know, and you know you're alive, and you know you're going to die because you can predict, you feel you've lost your innocence. Something's gone wrong. This, in the Christian tradition, was the knowledge of good and evil. What it says in Hebrew is not exactly moral good and evil that was known as a result of eating the fruit of the tree, but what was advantageous and disadvantageous. It gave you the gift of being like God. That is to say, the gift of being able to control the course of events. And anybody who controls the course of events, you see, probably puts himself in the situation of the sorcerer's apprentice. The Lord looking down there and says, okay, you wanted to be God, man, you go ahead and try. You get in more and more of a mess. You know, you succeed amazingly. Just like the sorcerer's apprentice actually made that broom go and fetch water for him. But he couldn't stop it. And as we say today, you can't stop progress. So then the whole problem of self-consciousness is that you're always in a dither and a doubt. We call this anxiety. And a nostalgia develops among us for the age of innocence. Would it be nice not to have to make any decisions, to act entirely on whim? And if you got into trouble, well, that would be all right, because you wouldn't have been worrying about it. See, when a moth mistakes a candle for its sex call, which is what happens, that's why moths fly into candles, the moth makes a mistake, and powie, it goes out. That's that. Moth doesn't worry on the way to the candle whether it's going to get burned. And, of course, the moths are sufficiently prolific so that one moth more or less lost in a candle doesn't matter. Hundreds of moths lost in candles don't matter. They just go on. And so you might imagine a human civilization where people make mistakes, and yes, they go off with a glorious bang instead of a whimper. And that's that. They wouldn't worry. They'd live magnificently. But we can't possibly go back and do that. You can't on purpose give up self-consciousness. You can't give up worrying. You can't give up thinking about yourself. And above all, you're terrified to live spontaneously, because you might do something wrong. However, the center of Zen training is to live spontaneously. And this is why it's so fascinating to many Western people, especially Western intellectuals, who are overburdened with self-consciousness. Because what fascinated people about Zen when they first heard of it through Dr. Suzuki's writings was Zen stories. I lent a book of Zen stories once to a friend of mine, years and years ago, and he was in hospital. And when he gave it back to me, he said, gee, he said, I didn't understand a word of it, but it cheered me up enormously. So Zen, the literature of Zen especially the literature of Zen in its earlier days, in the Tang Dynasty in China. We'll say a literature that runs from approximately 700 AD to 1000 AD. This span of years is the golden age of Zen. And almost all the literature of the period in early Buddhist Chinese is anecdotes about the encounters of Zen masters with their students. They are called in Japanese mondo, which means question-answer. And it appears that the way of studying Zen in those days was rather unlike the way of studying it now. Now Zen is settled and is studied in communities, such as we've been looking at, and will be staying in tomorrow night. But in those days, Zen was a wandering thing. In other words, if you became a Zen monk, you did a great deal of traveling. And instead of sitting on your fanny most of the day, you trudged. You were walking along through prairies, mountain paths, rugged country. You were visiting master after master after master to find one who would answer your question. Now, in a very natural way, supposing a person is questing, you are a seeker. You're not a phony seeker, but a real seeker. That is to say, you have within you a burning desire to find out what it's all about. Who you are, what life is, what reality is, or what's the way out of the mess. You want to become, instead of a mixed-up human being, you want to become something as simple and genuine as a tiger or a cat or a bird or a Buddha. So, those monks used to wander and wander and wander in search of a man who would answer the question. So one of the first stories is that when bodhidarma, or dharma, who you see all over Japan as the man with big eyes, a bushy beard, usually dressed in red with no legs, he came to where Bodhidharma was meditating and said, "Master, I have no peace of mind. Please pacify my mind." Of course, he didn't even get in for a long time to ask the question, because Bodhidharma refused to see anybody. Finally, when he cut off his left arm as a token of his sincerity and presented it to the master, Bodhidharma said, "All right, what do you want?" Well, he said, "I have no peace of mind." The mind in Chinese is shin, and it isn't quite what we mean by mind. They locate it here, Japanese kokoro. We locate our mind here. But this